to make you host things like that. And so he had his incredible revelation of the Aeon of Maat. And we have our next speaker, Michael Staley, speaking to us from England. It's Michael Staley, not Richard. And he's going to be presenting some talk based around his incredible new book, The Incoming Aeon of Maat, Letters Between Charles Stansfeld Jones and Gerald York. And really looking forward to this talk. And we had originally planned to have a conference coinciding with Camp Crowley before all this COVID hit. And here's Michael's new book. We were going to call the conference, because it's held in Vancouver, the Frater R.C. Symposium of the Occult Arts. Maybe that'll happen sometime. If we get through this COVID stuff and get through to the other end. And Michael Staley, we're going to pass over hosting capabilities to you.
Done.
And
okay.
You should be able to, yeah. Have you got the hosting capabilities?
You should have it.
You should have it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll click share screen.
Absolutely. You're in control. Can you make him full screen? Yep, that's probably him. There we go.
Wunderbar. All right, I'm going to mute it. I'm going to mute us. Hi, Richard.
Okay, can you see?
We can see you.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing this evening is my talk really falls into three parts. The first part, and I think it's very necessary, is a brief overview of the Urquhart-Crowley relationship. I think this is necessary because the fact is that there's surprisingly large common ground between Urquhart and Crowley on the Aeon of Maat, surprisingly large. And then after that, I want to go on and consider a couple of other developments. And then I'm planning to draw upon my own experience. Okay. So Charles Stansfeld Jones was born in Fulham, London, on the 2nd of April, 1888. He came across Crowley's journal, The Equinox, in 1909 and joined the AA as a probationer later that year. He took the name Urquhart, a Hebrew word meaning one. His supervisor in the AA was initially JFC Fuller. And when Fuller broke with Crowley over the so-called Looking Glass trial, Crowley became the direct supervisor of Urquhart, and he began to take a keen interest in Urquhart. This first slide, it's a photograph that comes from relatively early in Urquhart's AA career, around 1913, and it shows his arm replete with cuts from the practice of Liber Jugorum, as it would. Liber Jugorum involved trying not to use a common word, such as I, and cutting oneself with a razor blade every time the word was uttered. The idea was to encourage self-discipline and vigilance. This is another photograph from around about this time, showing Urquhart, well, as you can see, kneeling at an altar. I think this is in the Vancouver Agape Temple or Lodge, but I can't be sure about that, so I won't state that with definiteness. Urquhart was also a member of the OTO, and he made rapid progress through the grades of the OTO, establishing a lodge of the OTO in Vancouver. I believe this photograph is taken from there. In June 1916, Crowley granted Urquhart the 9th degree. The letter granting Urquhart the 9th degree is dated Moon in Libra, which would make it 10th to the 12th of June. And that's actually the letter. I think it's very interesting to look at the date here, because we'll come in a moment to the events that made Crowley see Urquhart as his magical son, but we're only 1 or 2 weeks away from this now. This was a time of intense mystical and magical activity for Akkad, as an account that he gave some years subsequent to this makes clear. He says, the culmination came at the summer solstice of 1916, when, having done my best to strip myself of all that I had and was in the personal sense, I underwent a great initiation, obtaining, for one thing, Atma Dishana, and with it, or following it, a very great spiritual insight into the workings of the order of the AA and into the cosmic plan on the higher planes. This experience, as was afterwards discovered, clearly indicated the fulfillment of a prophecy made in 1904, before I knew anything of the order, and gave me a certain magical link with the outer head of the order, which he could not but recognize and has since continued to do so. Now, interestingly enough, that was written in 1924, and obviously the person to whom a magical link was made was Crowley. So Akkad, at least still in 1924, considered that link there. This attainment of Akkad's had a considerable impact on Crowley. For several years, Crowley had been preoccupied with the need for a successor. He envisaged a successor as a magical son, and he conducted a series of sex magical operations for that purpose. Akkad, who was technically a zealoter in the AA, took the oath of the abyss on the 21st June 1916, swearing to interpret every event as a particular dealing of God with his soul. He was reborn as Frater OIV-VIO, Magister Templi. On hearing this news, Crowley decided that Akkad was clearly the magical son, born from the sex magical operations which he had undertaken. Furthermore, because of Akkad's magical motto, meaning one, he decided that Akkad was the one spoken of in the Book of the Law, who would come after the beast and who would solve the mysteries of the book that he, the beast, couldn't. Crowley gave an account of this in his magical diary entry for August the 21st, 1916, and I want to read this to you now. An amazing discovery. The operations to have a child by Hilarion on July the 8th, 1916 onwards, 7 in all, and 1 upon Helen Wesley, ended September the 12th and September the 16th with 3 operations at the beginning and the end of Catamenia. These operations are described as particularly good. On September the 23rd, the word of the equinox was nebulae, i.e. the babe of the universe, as I now see it. This equinox, the word is Sol Omon, the child of David's adultery. Now, OIV-VIO was born on June the 21st, exactly 9 months after the Libra equinox. On conclusion of the equinox ceremony, Hilarion had seduced me, and I had concentrated on the word just obtained. It is really very remarkable that I did no operation for a child after September the 12th to the 16th. We were at Vancouver in October 1919, I 2 or 3 days earlier. It is to be noted, too, that Hilarion was the perfect scarlet woman, as described in chapter 3, verse 44 of the Book of the Law. Then, OIV-VIO may be the child coming from no expected house, since I always thought of a material baby and never tried for a spiritual son. And yet, the child of my bowels, since OIV-VIO has Sagittarius on the ascendant, and Sagittarius is on the cusp of my 6th house, Virgo, the bowels. And also because I did the 9th degree operations for him upon the body of Hilarion. Anyway, as a result of all this, Akkad became effectively Crowley's right-hand man. At the end of March 1918, Akkad sold up everything that he had and moved to New York to take part in many of the subsequent sessions of the Amalantra working, which had started in September that year. The existing record of the Amalantra working concludes in June 1918, and shortly afterwards, Crowley went to Esopus Island for a magical retirement. He was visited on occasions by his former mistress and seer of the Amalantra working, Roddy Minor, and on other occasions by Akkad. Shortly afterwards, in September 1918, Akkad began to have a series of insights into the Book of the Law. He came to see that the Hebrew word al and its reverse, la, meaning God and not, respectively, were the key to understanding the book. He started recording this and other insights in a document that consisted largely of diary entries, and he later called this Liber 31. He chose this name because the Hebrew word al enumerates as 31. Akkad completed Liber 31 in early November 1918, but decided not to pass it to Crowley for the time being. In March 1919, Crowley published Blue Equinox. This issue included extracts from Akkad's magical records as the first part of several projected parts setting out Akkad's attainment as a master of the temple. This part of the Blue Equinox was accompanied by a photograph of Akkad showing him in meditation, and that's the one there. In September 1919, Akkad finally sent Crowley his insights into Al as the key to the Book of the Law, and as he had embodied them in Liber 31. This slide here, it shows a page from Liber 31, actually the title page. This is not the original document from 1919, but a copy which Akkad had typed for Gerald York. Crowley was overjoyed to receive this and overjoyed at Akkad's insights, and his reaction was sent as a postcard to Akkad, and Akkad's actually recorded the reaction at the bottom of this title page. It is line drawn equals 418. Thou knowest not. Your key opens palace. Liber 220 has unfolded like a flower. All solved, even 276 and 347. Did you know that pi equals 3.1415993? And oh, lots more. In this brief ecstatic reaction, CCXX 220 is another name for the Book of the Law. 276 and 347 are particularly enigmatic verses which Crowley hadn't understood until then, and they appear to be a cipher. Well, as I said, Crowley was delighted, and in recognition of this massive contribution, he enhanced the title of the Book of the Law to Liber Alvel Legis, from Liber Legis, to incorporate Akkad's insights. Now, unfortunately, this was the high point of the relationship between Akkad and Crowley, and shortly afterwards, relations between the two men became strained. In 1920, Akkad had been introduced to another order, the Universal Brotherhood, of which Crowley took a particularly dim view, regarding it as as fraudulent. The Universal Brotherhood appears to have been founded sometime during the second half of the 19th century. And it was an order with, shall we say, Christian roots, but the sort of Christianity we're talking about is what they refer to as High Church, bordering on Roman Catholic, really. Arkad tried to interest his friends and colleagues in the Universal Brotherhood with varying degrees of success. Nevertheless, he became increasingly absorbed in the work of the Universal Brotherhood throughout the 1920s, to Crowley's considerable annoyance, because Crowley thought that Arkad was thereby neglecting his duties. Anyway, Arkad actually prospered in the Universal Brotherhood, and sometime in the late 20s, early 1930s, he actually became the head. To add further to the tension between Crowley and Arkad, in 1921, the then head of the OTO, Theodore Royce, issued Arkad with a charter appointing him as head of the OTO for North America. This was particularly galling for Crowley because Crowley had maintained that the charter that he'd got from Royce back in 1912 or 1913 covered the United States. Arkad was soon challenging him on this point and seeking clarification. This tension with Crowley notwithstanding, this period of the early to mid-20s was actually a very creative one for Arkad. He published QBL, or The Bride's Reception, in 1922, The Egyptian Revival in 1923, and The Anatomy of the Body of God in 1925. These are considered his three major works, but he also published many others. In 1923 alone, he published three further titles: 31 Hymns to the Star Goddess, Crystal Vision Through Crystal Gazing, and The Chalice of Ecstasy. He also published at this time a diagram, The Wheel of the Tarot, which is here. It's very, very complex. It basically plots the various cards of the tarot against the wheel of the zodiac, the zodiacal signs. I've been using this myself for about a year now in some private work from private ritual work that I do, and it's a very intense piece of work. In addition, though, to all this, Arkad contributed a large number of articles, many of them published in the magazine with which he was associated at this time, the Occult Press Review. This here is the cover of one of his issues, and it contains an article by Arkad. Not so much an article, it was his review of a book by Dr. Raymond Buck called Cosmic Consciousness. It's excellent, absolutely excellent. He also actually devised some songs they called Three Songs of the New Aeon. Enclosed here are The Ibis, The Bennu Bird, and The Star Goddess. So he was a bit of a polymath, really. Now, for some years, Arkad had also become extremely interested in references in the Book of the Law, chapter 3, verse 34, which Crowley had interpreted as referring to the Aeon to succeed the Aeon of Maat. Sorry, the Aeon of Horus. Getting a bit in front of myself here. Anyway, the verse in the Book of the Law reads, "But your holy place shall be untouched throughout the centuries, though with fire and with sword it be burnt down and shattered, yet an invisible house there standeth, and shall stand until the fall of the great equinox, when Hermetic shall arise and the double-wanded one assume my throne and place. Crowley's old comment to this verse included the following passage. Following him, Horus, will arise the equinox of Maat, the goddess of justice. It may be 100 or 10,000 years from now, for the computation of time is not here as there. Crowley's new comment, written in the early 1920s at Châteauroux, makes a further interesting remark on the relationship between the two eons. There is no violent antithesis as that between Osiris and Horus. Strength will prepare the reign of justice. We should begin already, as I deem, to regard this justice as the ideal, whose way we should make ready by virtue of our force and fire. The Aeon to come after Horus was characterized by Akkad as the Aeon of truth and justice, and also known as the Aeon of Maat, or Maat. Crowley was interested in this too, as I think these two comments, the old comment and the new comment, demonstrate. But more than anything else, he was focused on the Aeon of Horus, and he expected Akkad to concentrate on assisting him in his work of promulgating the Aeon of Horus. Well, there was still yet other sources of tension going into this rather febrile mix. As we've seen, Akkad was by now writing and publishing his own books, and Crowley disliked them intensely. Another major source of tension was over Crowley's stock of books, which he had arranged to be sent over from England. Akkad arranged and paid for their storage. He was authorized by Crowley to sell these books, keeping a proportion of the money for himself and forwarding the rest to Crowley. Well, Crowley received little in the way of money, and he came to suspect that Akkad was defrauding him. He set up a committee with 3 hand-picked members to investigate the matter. Perhaps not surprisingly, the committee found in Crowley's favour, and a legal document, the release, was drawn up by legal representatives on both sides to settle and then to sever financial relations between the two men. And this document was executed on the 4th of June, 1926. As we've seen earlier, for some years, Akkad had focused his work in the Universal Brotherhood, and that work continued and indeed intensified throughout the period of deteriorating relations with Crowley, and including this rather long-running dispute over the books. Shortly before the final legal document, the release, was executed, Akkad received a word, monio. I've not come across any accounts by Akkad of how this word was received, nor what he thought that it signified. Many years later, in his correspondence of 1948 with Gerald York, he speculated that this word monio may have been the word which Crowley had tried and failed to receive in connection with his attainment to the grade of Magus. Writing to York in 1948, Akkad quoted from a letter which Crowley had written to him in July 1916 about the problems he was having, waiting to receive his word as Magus. I'm still in profundis. I wrote an essay on God as a sadist 2 days ago, and yesterday went through a big magical ceremony, but nothing seems to revive me. I can't learn to wait for the word properly. I believe if I could only do that for 10 minutes, the word would come. And then, continuing his letter to York of 1948, he went on, about 10 years later, on May the 8th, 1926, at 6:19 p.m. in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, in the presence of a living witness to whom it was immediately communicated, the word was obtained by one which Liber Legis prophesied should obtain the key of it all. This word, when comprehended rightly, clearly shows this, for it contains many formulae and special virtues. After this, Akkad's initiations continued in 1932 with what he referred to as the Silver Star initiations, and to mark which he designed a particularly lovely letterhead that he used henceforth. And indeed, most of his letters to York actually are on this letterhead. That's got a sort of furry appearance because it had to be scanned from a letter, the paper of which has got a rough texture. And so that's how it came out. Yeah. He wrote to Crowley that year in rather humorous terms, letting him know about the initiations, firstly the reception of Monio, and secondly the Silver Star initiations. But he tended to have very, very waspish humour, and Crowley really didn't appreciate it, replied tersely, that was that. Well, a number of years passed, and the silence between the two men was next broken by Crowley in 1936. He was working on the Equinox of the Gods, and he wished to write about Akkad's discovery in 1918 of Al as the key to the Book of the Law. These insights which Akkad had recorded in Liber 31, that he given to Crowley, that Crowley was very enthusiastic about. For a while, this correspondence in 1936 between the two men was respectful and positive. Crowley stating that he thought that Akkad's role in plumbing the depths of the Book of the Law had a lot further to go. He also acknowledged Akkad's role in preparing for the Aeon of Truth and Justice. Take, for instance, this passage from a letter that Crowley wrote in July 1936. Your preparations for the Aeon of Justice seem to me, personal to yourself, incidents in the course of your initiation, and I have no doubt that they will flower at the fall of the great equinox. But I think that your position in respect to the Aeon of Horus is to be considered of supreme importance at this juncture. I do not at all think that your work in respect of the Book of the Law has passed beyond its beginning. I regard the curious experience through which you have passed as a necessary training for your full assumption of your office. Well, this was the high point, and I think it actually says quite a lot. But shortly afterwards, the correspondence descended into mutual suspicion and acrimony, and Crowley dredged up yet again his conviction, his suspicion that Akkad had stolen his books and was waiting for his, Crowley's, death before bringing them out to sell at a vast profit. Anyway, it went from bad to worse, and the correspondence ended with Crowley issuing a notice of the expulsion of Akkad from the OTO. In 1936, whilst all this was going on, in May 1936 to be precise, Akkad established a lodge, Emmanuel Lodge, for the purpose of the ritual transmission of Munio. It was to be concentrated in 3 initiatory degrees. Interestingly, he established the lodge not within the Universal Brotherhood, but using a charter he had received from Heinrich Trenker, the German OTO head, in 1924 for the establishment of a branch of Panzer IV in America. Well, Akkad being Akkad, he made it into a letterhead that he used. He used for the purpose of communication between various members of the lodge, and also used on notepaper to York when he told him about this lodge. And that's it. As you can see, it's a very, very beautiful thing. Authorised by letters patent in 1924, that refers to the charter that I mentioned a minute or two ago from Heinrich Trenker. The interesting thing is that Akkad appears not to have done anything with this charter up until this point. So one wonders exactly why he chose to activate it now. Although Akkad did attempt contact a couple of times before Crowley's death, the two men actually had no further contact apart from a very indirect letter from Akkad to Crowley via his friend Handy. But Crowley was very dismissive of this, and that came to no direct contact between them. After Crowley's death in December 1947, his friend, longtime supporter, and one-time disciple in the AA, Gerald York, was ordering Crowley's papers. Crowley had directed in his will that his papers be sent over to his nominated successor in the OTO and in the AA, Carl Gomer. And York was the person gathering them together. He noticed that amongst these papers, there wasn't a copy of Liber 31, Akkad's discovery of the importance of vow to the Book of the Law, and he thought there should be. So he wrote to Akkad asking for a copy. Akkad actually had it typed up again and sent him a copy, but more to the point, it sparked off a correspondence between the two men that went on throughout 1948 and 1949. I was very copious and had an absolutely riveting amount of detail about the relationships of both men to Crowley. Akkad's letters in particular are an absolute mine of information. And then suddenly, in early April 1948, Akkad announced that he had detected the incoming of the Aeon of Truth and Justice. This was something that subsequently was discussed at great length in the correspondence between Akkad and York. York made it plain that he'd never been happy with what he saw as the harshness, the force and fire of Horus, and was only too happy at the idea that there might be something that would ameliorate this harshness, this what he saw as this unnecessary cruelty of the force and fire of Horus. However, he could not believe that the Aeon of Horus had ended after a mere 44 years from 1904. Akkad maintained that the incoming of the Aeon of Truth and Justice did not mean that the Aeon of Horus had been cut short, but that on the contrary, the Aeon of Horus was continued in the Aeon of Truth and Justice. Interestingly, support for this view can be found in Crowley's work. For instance, the new comment, which I read out earlier, I'll read out the relevant passage again because I can't expect you to have committed all my words to memory, doubtlessly profound though they are. So Crowley says, apropos this, note the close connection between Leo and Libra in the tarot. The numbers 8 and 11, that's adjustment and lust, being interchanged with 11 and 8. There is no violent antithesis as that between Osiris and Horus. Strength will prepare the reign of justice. We should begin already, as I deem, to regard this justice as the ideal, whose way we should make ready by virtue of our force and fire. So, to my mind, what this shows is that this wasn't really very much out of line with what Crowley himself thought. Then, in the summer of 1948, York became aware that Akkad had recently come across a collection of diaries, notebooks and typescripts that Crowley had left with Akkad when leaving America for Chifaloo. Seems Akkad had just put them up in his attic and forgotten about them. Being a collector, York was anxious to get his hands on these documents, or at least on copies of them. Akkad, though, was hesitant. York pushed a little too hard, and as a result, relations between Akkad and he cooled significantly, as did the frequency of writing. This slide shows Akkad in middle age, as he would have been at the time of the correspondence with York. His face wasn't really that blurry, it's just a very low resolution photograph. And this is a photograph of Gerald York on holiday in the late 1940s in the north of England, in the Lake District. And he's with his eldest son, Michael. Sorry, John, not Michael. Michael's me. And so this is how York would have been at the time of the correspondence of 1948, 1949. This here is a letterhead, another letterhead that Akkad had made up in March 1943, when he had an important insight into the word manifestation. And I'll come on to that in a minute. Akkad died in February 1950. His work on the Aeon of Maat was not really continued by his successors in the Universal Brotherhood. I don't think they really understood Akkad's work, but they sensed that it was important and should be preserved in case the time came when it could be understood. This is conveyed in the letter of an unknown correspondent to John Cowell, Akkad's successor. As I see it, the thing to do is to obtain the other copy of Liber 31 from Molina. Molina was Akkad's wife in the UB. And when I return all the papers you have sent me without retyping them, they should be put together in our archives. I've arrived at this opinion by a close study of the Akkad York letters, and as already suggested, you can only see the whole picture by a light study of them. Certainly, the letters should form part of the record and be included in the archives also. Then the entire work will be preserved for some future person, providentially raised up and qualified to deal with it. There is an interesting parallel, I think, with the work of Jack Parsons. Like Akkad, he saw a need for an ameliorating feminine influence to assuage the harshness of the force and fire of Horus, and he expressed this in terms of tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. He conceived of this force as Babylon, and he wrote about this in an untitled essay as yet unpublished, the transcript of which survives in the Gerald York collection at the Warburg in London. He says, "The Aeon of Horus is of the nature of a child. To perceive this, we must conceive of the nature of a child without the veil of sentimentality, beyond good and evil, perfectly gentle, perfectly ruthless, containing all the possibilities within the limits of heredity, and highly susceptible to training and environment. But the nature of Horus is also the nature of force, blind, terrible, unlimited force. That is why the West stands in imminent danger of annihilation. That is why the West also stands in the possibility of the most rapid and tremendous evolution that the world has ever known. The balance must be love and understanding, or else all else fails. Now we have said enough for this place. Then let the student read and meditate upon the ritual of Horus, constructing the total nature of Horus out of the polyphony of the component concepts. And, if he dare, let him invoke Horus and partake of the power and energy that is his right under the new Aeon. And let him also consider the love whereby Horus may be fulfilled and dignified. And meditating on this, let him prevision and invoke that which is to come. And he expands on this in a paragraph a bit later on. This is where he likens it to Yod He Vav He. Among the ancient Hebrews, the name of God was Yod He Vav He. This is perhaps the most magnificent formula ever devised for symbolizing at once the whole process of nature and the highest accounts of magic. Yod symbolizes God as the primal father, the solar phallic creative will or fire. He symbolizes God as the mother, the feminine generative principle, the passive will or water. Vav symbolizes God as the son, the male child of the father and of the mother, the will to go, air. He final symbolizes God as the daughter, Babylon, she who is to come, Earth, the virgin who unites with the father, stimulates him to reactivity, and begins the generative process all over again. The cycle is closed, the process is eternal, and contains within itself the seeds of all possibility. Well, skipping ahead a good few years, in the early 1970s, a woman in America, Margaret Ingalls, received a text which purported to be from the Aeon of Maat, which in this text was characterized as some 2,000 years hence. This text was Liber Pene Praenumbra, the book of the foreshadowing of the feather. Margaret Ingalls was impressed to send a copy of this to Kenneth Grant, whose third book, Cults of the Shadow, was being printed at the time. In late 1950, at York's request, Grant had made typed copies of the letters between York and Uckard. Although he had been broadly sceptical of the incoming of the Aeon of Maat, as outlined by Uckard, and indeed he said as much in the chapter on Uckard in Cults of the Shadow, it is clear from the early correspondence with Margaret Ingalls that he was beginning to revise his opinion before she wrote to him. Grant made references to her work in his next book, Night Side of Eden. However, it is his book after that, Outside the Circles of Time, which makes a much more detailed study of the received texts and other documents which Margaret Ingalls generated subsequently. Before receiving the text of Liber Pennae Pronumbra, Margaret Ingalls had not come across the Uckard-York correspondence, and there are few points of similarity between what she received and Uckard's work. However, the sense emerges of the Aeons of Horace and Maat comprising the double current, which fits quite well with Uckard's contention to York in 1948 that the Aeon of Maat was the fulfillment and continuation of the Aeon of Horace. Grant made a link between Uckard's work and his earlier participation in 1918 in the Amalantrah working. The egg was the predominant feature of many of the sessions which comprised the Amalantrah working. And the egg entered into Uckard's work overtly in a very curious fashion. In March 1948, it struck Uckard that there was something significant about the word manifestation. This word occurs in the first and last verses of the Nuit chapter of the Book of the Law. He became convinced that this was the secret word of Nuit, referred to elsewhere in that chapter. Now, manifestation, when transliterated into Hebrew characters, enumerates as 257. Taking the word monio, which is clearly a foreshadowing of the word manifestation, we get monio equaling 107. The remaining letters, we get 150. Now, 107, he linked via gematria to Baitza, egg. 150, he linked to QN, nest. Thus, manifestation, he was able to parallel in this way with egg and nest, and more succinctly as the egg within the nest. Uckard didn't have much to say about the nature of the Aeon of Maat, about what it might mean and so forth. He was, I think, simply recording the birth of a new eon, and the nature of it will become apparent as it unfolds. Thus, I can't tell you here tonight what it all means. There is a point of view that the eons are not spans of time, but states of awareness. In my own experience, I've come to identify the Aeon of Maat with the clarity of Advaita Vedanta. For me, the word thelema indicates not a personal true will, which is buried within us each, waiting to be discovered, but rather a cosmic suprapersonal will, the will of God, the will of the cosmos. I use Uckard's word of 1926, monio, in my magical work and find it very fertile and full of potential. I mentioned a little bit earlier that Uckard's colleagues in the Universal Brotherhood saw the need to preserve Uckard's work, and in particular the correspondence with Gerald York, for future people to arise who might understand it. In fact, this isn't in terms of a person, a big beast, a successor to Crowley, to Uckard, and various people in between like Grant. I think actually that anyone who chooses to work with this material is thereby a successor, succeeding to Uckard. Anybody who's influenced by his work, who tries to plumb the depths. I'd like to, about a year before the publication of The Incoming of the Aeon of Maat, I was going through, for the umpteenth time, you just can't imagine how much bloody proofreading I did of that book. And I came to an account, this account of Uckard, whereby he was talking about the discovery of manifestation, the discovery of egg and nest. And suddenly something struck me forcibly that hadn't struck me before. I meet with some colleagues in the lodge. Well, once every few weeks. Well, I mean, obviously we're meeting via Zoom at present. Anyway, basically it's a lodge of work on LAM, the Laman Lodge, within Order Typhonis. And our current method of working actually takes elements from a particular scene of the Amalantra working. And the locale, the location for this working is, there is a ring of mountain ranges, and within this there's a lake. Within the lake is an island, and this island is actually contains the woodland glade from the Amalantra working, and it's it runs up into woodland, etc. And we work in the imagination. But all of a sudden, as I say, I was struck by the fact that, unbeknownst to us for all this time, we've actually somehow been influenced by Akkad's work, by this particular realization of Akkad. Similarly, I've been very struck by the word of 1926, manio. I use that, I vibrate it, I use it in this particular lunar working that I've been occupied on now for the best part of the year. And I have to say that I find it bloody good. I rather love it. I would even go so far as to say that it is this word manio, which is at the root of Akkad's work. It is this word manio that later came into fuller view as manifestation, and that actually triggered the incoming of the Aeon of Maat in 1948. I believe that the work that Akkad did, vibrating this word ritually in 1936 in Emmanuel Lodge, I think that has carried on vibrating, and it is this that has led to the upsurge of interest in Akkad that I've noticed over the last few years. Well, I'd like to bring this to a close by reading out one of Akkad's hymns in his 31 hymns to the Star Goddess. This one is actually hymn number 30, Justice. I am a fool, O beloved, and therefore am I one or naught, as the fancy takes me. Now I am come to justice, so that I may be all or naught, according to the direction of vision. No breath may stir the feather of truth. Therefore is justice alone in L. Yet the ox goad is motion, and the breath matter, if it be called the ox, which is also A. How foolish are these thoughts, which are but as a sword in the hand of justice. They are as unbalanced as the scales that stir not, being fixed in the grasp of the figure of law above the courthouse of a great city. But thou hast said, love is the law, love under will. And love is the will to change, and change is the will to love. Even in the stern outline of the scales of justice, do I perceive the instrument of love. And in the life sentence, the mystery of imprisonment in thy being, O beloved. Thank you. That's the end.
Just a second here. Thank you, Michael Staley. That was absolutely fabulous. I think we're clapping here for everybody that listened to the presentation. That breathes some fresh new air and everything. Yeah, thank you so much. And it's open up for questions. We got a few minutes here before we get on to our next speaker, who I've introduced 3 times, Richard Kaczynski. So we got a few minutes if somebody has some questions. Any questions? Michael, I don't think Michael met Akkad. No, Michael's like not too much older than me. You never met. You knew Kenneth Grant.
You worked with Kenneth Grant, correct?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I knew Kenneth from the mid-1970s.
Do you know
becoming a member?
Do you know how much of the content? I'm wondering if you know how much of the content of the Tunnels of Set in the Night Side of Eden were taken from Akkad, or how much were Grant's original work?
To be honest, it's Grant's original work. With Night Side of Eden, it's divided into 2 parts. It's the second part, which is the Tunnels of Set. The first part is a number of chapters on various topics, and it's amongst those chapters that Ander Hadner, Margaret Ingalls, Nema is first introduced. But no, I get the impression that the work on the Tunnels of Set really is something that he developed from New Isis Lodge.
Yeah, I always thought it was his original work, but then some people were proposing other ideas. But it is his original work.
No,
set.
I don't think that Akkad ever did that sort of work, really.
No. Thank you.
You know, I noticed like the modern Universal Brotherhood, they have a website, The Great Circle, and it's like Steiner's mentioned and other people that were in their past were mentioned, but it's like Akkad's completely missing from the history that they offer. And I was wondering if you thought that there was any reason why that.
Yes, I've heard that.
Do you think there's
yeah, I do really. I mean, well, you see, to be honest, I kind of rather have the impression that the Universal Brotherhood tended to be organized in cells with different kind of streams. And I think it was a very specific stream that Akkad joined, of which he became the head in the late 20s, early 30s, and of which he himself was succeeded by his student John Cowell. So it kind of sounds to me as if this revived Universal Brotherhood comes from another stream that Akkad never encountered. Well, you know, that's my theory anyway.
Do you know anything about his relationship with the avant-garde artist Harry Smith?
No, I don't actually. Basically, I co-edited and co-commented and co-footnoted The Incoming of the Aeon of Maat with a friend of mine, Michael Barham, a collector, and he actually knows much more about this relationship with Harry Clark, and he commented on it in the introduction to the book, but I myself don't know very much about that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Oh, well, sorry, is it Harry Clark or Harry Smith?
I think it's Harry Smith. Yeah, Harry Smith.
Harry Smith, I think.
I thought maybe I'd messed up, but no, it's Harry Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess we should probably start switching Richard over to the. Can you switch him over to have control of the thing? And our next speaker, third time's the charm, I've introduced him a few times already, is the great Richard Kaczynski, probably the foremost historian on Crowley and matters involving the OTO and Crowley-related stuff. His biography, Per Durabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley, is a must-read for anybody that wants to really understand Aleister Crowley. And his book, The Forgotten Templars, fills in so many holes regarding the origins of the Knight Templar. It as well is an important volume, and Richard is to be respected by one and all. And here he is at the final hour, and Richard Kaczynski, take it away.
Well, thank you so much. First, let me ask, are you able to hear me okay? Is my volume level all right?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Super. Michael, so glad to hear from you. Sorry we couldn't be doing this in person. And you're certainly a tough act to follow. There's a number of things in your talk that made me sit up and take notice. I may drop you a line later this week about it.
Okay.
But yes, thank you to Chris and SOMA Institute for inviting me to address all of you today, and thank all of you for taking time out of your day to tune in. As Chris had said, I'm here to talk about the life of Aleister Crowley as part of a celebration of his birthday today. And what I will do with my talk here today is I will start with a little bit of a presentation just to kind of give a overview of, very briefly, of Crowley's life. And then what we'll be able to do is go into more detail on various aspects of his life